Now comes another big discussion, okay, for this session, the Miller cycle based discussion. So, a Miller cycle is applicable only to TGDI engine, all right? That is the first take. Then we have TGDI engine, okay, which is the G20 TGDI in the 700 Scorpio N, the all new Thar. And another is the 300 TGDI engine, okay? So, Miller cycle is applicable only for TGD engines as of now. All right, that's what we have been discussing. So, all right, what exactly what do we mean by Mylar cycle? If that question pops up, so the first line makes it very very clear, right? So the Mylar cycle is an over-expanded engine cycle. So we have the PV diagram over here. Okay, so both the Otto cycle or the Otto cycle and Mylar cycle, they both are denoted here, right? So Otto cycle is denoted by the solid lines. That's the traditional cycle, and the Mylar cycle is denoted by the dotted blue lines. All right, so which is the point of discussion over here. So what we see is in the Mylar cycle, here we are closing the intake valve early. All right. So the strategy reduces effective compression ratio. All right. And we'll have higher geometric compression ratio. So with all this, it allows us to do what allows us to achieve higher brake thermal efficiency, then reduce pumping losses, and in the process it also reduces say CO2 emissions, right? Like the stuff which is mentioned or the text here. Okay, so eventually the emissions get reduced for the same performance output. So now that is important. So you're doing the Miller cycle. That doesn't mean your performance is going to ultimately get hindered in any way. So if you look at this diagram, right? So for the conventional cycle, okay, so from 1 to 5 would be the suction stroke, okay, wherein say the charge is going to get sucked, all right, inside the cylinder. Then from 5 to 2, the volume is going to get reduced. So that means, all right, you can just observe it, all right? So x-axis is like your volume, and say the y-axis has your pressure. Obviously, during the compression stroke, the volume is certainly going to shrink. All right, so that is the moment from say the 5 to 2. All right, and say the piston moves up to the TDC and the and compresses the air inside. And then what happens? The spark plug would ultimately ignite the mixture. That's like from 2 to 3. The explosion of charge happens, temperature surges, and then we have the expansion stroke. That's like a 3 to 4 moment we're talking in terms of. All right. And for Miller cycle, right, as the compression ratio is going to be higher, right, the clearance volume is going to be reduced further. So the suction here would start at 1 dash, okay, up to 1A. So that is like your suction. And from 1A, the intake valve is going to close, right? So once your intake valve closes, there is no new air which is going to ultimately say enter the combustion chamber, all right? So that means 1A, your intake valve close and your what you call your piston is still like going down, and that's reaching say your BDC. That is up to say 5A. All right. So whatever air is getting sucked inside is trapped in the, you can say, the combustion chamber. And once it is say your piston has hit the BDC, right? So eventually after that, what is going to happen? Say the uh, expansion is going to happen. The volume increases, and that is why we call it say the over expanded say in engine cycle. Okay, so the air that was trapped inside that will eventually like expand, and so after that it's all the conventional like portion. So there's nothing say different to be spoken over there. So major change, okay, for Miller cycle perspective. So that is like from 1A to 5A. All right. So since we are closing the intake valve early, so which is why the volume of air say that's sucked in is actually reduced. Okay, so that is with respect to making sense of this information which is out there in front of us, like how does it apply to our cars? Fine, fine. So let's move ahead. Now the discussion doesn't end here. We have more to discuss. So that means we spoke about like certain things like what Miller cycle employs. So that means like you have the mentioning of say higher geometry compression ratio, then your early intake valve closure strategy, and with reduced intake valve lift. Now this is important over here, just like keep it at the back of your head. All right. So it is not only your early intake valve closure, but it is also got to do with say your reduced intake valve lift. So both we need to be aware of, and then it also employs say EVGT. All right. So now there are more diagrams here. So just look at this graph over here. You have the conventional graph and say the Miller cycles graph. So all right, just take 10 seconds, 10 or 15 seconds to ultimately go through this figure. So what the x-axis has, x-axis that's going to have say the crank angle, which is in degrees. Y-axis is got to do with say your valve lift. Okay, valve lift is denoted in millimeters. So now you have two colors over here, red and blue. The color of the curve, okay, if it is red is the valve lift for the exhaust valve, right? And say the blue would be the valve lift for the intake valve, all right? The, the easiest perspective, see, we're talking in terms of reduced intake valve lift, and eventually you have this line, which is smaller blue line for Miller cycle. So that's your intake, which we are talking about. Fine. So the reduced valve intake valve lift for Miller means the blue line ought to be shorter, all right, as compared to the conventional cycle. Fine. So just like I am emphasizing on that particular, say, point of discussion, which I just highlighted. All right. So then what else we come across? Uh, Early intake closure strategy, if we were to ultimately take that discussion forward. So in the conventional figure, the intake valve is closing around, say, if we were to go to this specific, it's closing around 620 or 630 degrees of the crank angle. Miller diagram, we see the intake closure, it's around say 560 degrees of say the crank angle. All right. And what we understand is okay, the Miller cycle, the intake valve closes early, right? Point taken, man. Let's move ahead. Right. So then there is one center diagram right over here. It says partial filling of combustion chamber during intake phase, okay, which is because of the early intake valve closure. Pretty obvious that one is. So now the difference between BS 6.1 and 6.2 is the profile of camshaft, right? And this is applicable for all the TGDI engines. Then everything sounds good. I hope like, we have a fair idea with respect to like what exactly is going on, with respect to this particular discussion. So the final goal of adopting Miller cycle, all right, like is what? What is it? So with respect to complying with the emission regulation, like how does it make sense? So it's eventually to ultimately bring the harmful emissions lower, ultimately bring the NOx lower. So Miller cycle achieves this by increasing the efficiency of engine, okay, which eventually, what do you call, which in turn reduces fuel consumption and emissions. That's the highlight. So by employing higher geometry compression ratio and what else we discussed over here, that was the early intake valve closure, right? So these strategies for the Miller cycle, okay, ultimately would be, say, put in place. And that's how we are able to achieve more complete combustion of the air fuel mixture. So uh, this does what? The amount of unburned fuel is ultimately going to come down, and that is what is going to bring the NOx lower, right, during combustion, we can say. And then you also have the EVGT, which ultimately, like, does is going to do all the heavy lifting with respect to the Miller cycle for reducing your emissions, right? So we don't need to get into the VGT discussions. We know how it goes about. All right. I hope we got the broader picture. All right. So we took our own sweet time with respect to discussing Miller cycle. So the goal was to improve engine efficiency, reducing emissions, all that. So right. So that means you're following all the regulation. but at the same time, right, there is no compromise, okay, in performance and fuel economy. Because that is what, like, the end user would actually, find interesting, right? Where you're doing good for the planet. At the same time, the driving experience is not hindered in any way.